Welcome to Rite Good, the podcast that helps you write good. I'm Raquel S. Benedict, the most dangerous woman in speculative fiction. In this episode, we are joined by John Langan, author of the Bram Stoker Award-winning novel The Fisherman, House of Windows, and many, many spooky short stories. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's my great pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
So I guess my first question, I hope this isn't too personal, is what scares you?
Oh my goodness, everything. I I would like, on the one hand, some of my answers are comparatively mundane.
Right.
Spiders, I wish it weren't so. I appreciate what spiders do,
They're
and
demons.
If I find one in the house, I will try to catch it and put it outside as opposed to killing it. But
Mm.
many years ago now, my wife and I were at a zoo exhibit with our son, and they were bringing around various creepy crawly creatures. And
Nice.
they brought around a snake. And I'm also afraid of snakes, but I was able to, it was like a python or something like that. And I was able to take the python in my hands, and it was surprisingly warm and alive. But then they brought around a tarantula, and
Nope.
I tried, and I couldn't do it. So some of my fears are just utterly mundane in that regard. And then others, I've become much more afraid of human stupidity and gullibility, however you'd like to put that, our susceptibility to cults and cultish behavior over the
Yeah.
last 4 years. And I'm also afraid of death and of terrible things happening to those I love. So yeah, I don't I feel like I have a whole bunch of fears, and I feel like they're actually somewhat pedestrian, to be honest.
Yeah. We're all scared of them for a reason. I don't know what it is in us that makes us afraid of spiders, but there's just
Yeah,
too many legs.
I
That's not
wonder
an
about that.
acceptable number of legs.
Well, so whatever it was, however many 100 million years ago, they were the dominant life form on Earth, and I guess they were considerably bigger because it was a more oxygen rich atmosphere, and so they could support them a larger size of spider. I sometimes wonder if there's some kind of genetic thing from our proto ancestors that's gotten through to us. Like, watch out for these guys because they'll get you.
Yeah, there's probably a good reason. Next question. Who are your biggest writing influences, would you say?
Oh my goodness! In some ways, I feel like that I guess the book that made me want to be a writer was Stephen King's Christine, which I read when
Mm.
I was a freshman in high school, and it just utterly magnetized me. It was a real like conversion experience. Before that, I had read a ton of comic books. So I suppose, in some ways, when I think about the kind of florid writing, the melodramatic excess of like Stan Lee and Marv Wolfman and Len Wein, that I'm sure that's in the background of my head as well. Because I read comics, I also read a lot of Conan the Barbarian stories. That was how I got through fifth or sixth grade math class, for which I apologize, Sister Anne. I literally had the textbook up with the paperback behind it. Vivid memory of reading this Conan story called Rogues in the House, and Conan's in this life or death struggle with Thak, the man ape. And I'm like, oh my God, but I'm also trying to keep one eye on Sister Anne, who's doing whatever algebra we're doing at the board. And yeah, but yeah, it was discovering King that really made me think, no, this is what I have to do. And then since that time, to a certain extent, King is always there for me. He's always someone that I kind of go back to. But as I got older, writers like within the horror field, someone like Peter Straub became very, very important to me. And then outside of the horror field, people like Flannery O'Connor and Henry James and
Mm.
William Faulkner were all early and important influences. And I feel like in more recent years, it's been people more like Salman Rushdie and Shirley Jackson have been much more important to what I've been doing. I kind of feel sometimes like I don't know, influences. I think maybe it was Fritz Leiber or someone who said that, it's like waves rolling, that they sort of roll through you, and they keep emanating. And sometimes you're writing and you're like, oh, here I am back to Henry James again, or here I am back to Stephen King, or here it's maybe somebody else I wasn't even aware I was being influenced by.
You write about a lot of gruesome subjects, but is there any topic that you would consider off limits, at least for yourself, to use in a story?
I don't know. I've puzzled over this question. Like recently, I was listening to I have about an hour's commute to work. And so sometimes I'll listen to books on tape. And so I got this book on tape. It was Jeremy Irons reading Lolita.
Ooh,
And it's possibly the greatest book on tape I've ever listened to. Jeremy Irons he's a fantastic reader for this book. And it's a great novel, but holy cow, is it problematic.
yeah.
And I don't think I could write that kind of novel. I get, at least I think I get some of what Nabokov was up to in the novel, and I certainly would not tell anybody don't read the novel or it needs to be censored. No, but I, for myself, I don't feel that um, children in that kind of exploitative danger is something I'm just really comfortable with doing.
Yeah, it's a challenging subject, and approaching it the way Nabokov did was really daring and really unorthodox. And I mean, he pulled it off, and I think Lolita's a brilliant novel, but holy shit. Not
Yeah,
many people could do what he did without just making it a disaster.
yeah, I think that the sort of same thing with the famous sewer scene in It for the kids. Like, I understand why King did it, and I understand that there were arguments in favor of it, and I'm how would I put it, sensitive to those arguments. Like, I understand those arguments. I don't think it's the kind of thing that I could do.
Yeah.
And that may be, as much as anything, an awareness of my own limitations as a writer, and just my own sort of sensibilities and where I choose to concentrate my efforts.
Now, you would write a lot of what people consider cosmic horror. The Fisherman definitely was cosmic horror, and I'd say City of the Dog, which Stephen Mazer insisted that I read. It takes place in Albany. That's where you are, Raquel. You got to read City of the Dog. Is cosmic horror, and the standard cosmic horror story typically goes like this: a guy looks into something he probably shouldn't. Often it's monsters, and it drives him crazy. And we've been telling that story over and over again for a very long time. Even before Lovecraft and his many imitators, there was Robert W. Chambers's The King in Yellow. And even before that, I think you could probably trace back a lot of the themes and structure to ancient stories, like the story of Pandora's box, the story of Eve eating the forbidden fruit, Prometheus. Why do you think this one story still excites us even after so many retellings and so many times?
I think it is a kind of fundamental human story. We are driven to know. We can't help ourselves. We always want to know things. Somebody says, "I've got something to tell you," and you may find it upsetting. Even with that warning, even if somebody says to us, "Oh, I'm going to tell you something," and or I could tell you something, and it's terrible. Of course, we'll always say, "I want to know. I have to know." I think it's Robert Penn Warren who says something to the effect of, "The end of man is to know." And pardoning the gendered language there, I mean, there's some truth to that. That our desire, our purpose, but maybe also our destruction in some ways, is to know. We just want to know things. It's interesting that forbidden fruit, right? That in the Genesis narrative that Eve eats, it's the fruit of the tree of knowledge. There's also the tree of life, or I can't remember the exact name of it, but sort of the tree of immortality. She doesn't eat that first. That's not an issue. It's the tree of knowledge. That's what she wants. And in that narrative, as every time I teach that, I wind up teaching that narrative. I remind my students that the snake never lies. I mean, the snake doesn't tell the full truth, But the snake says, you'll know what God knows, and God doesn't want you to know what God knows. And indeed, and in fact, God has lied. I mean, okay, maybe God's just stretched the truth, but God has said, you eat that and you're dead. And Eve eats it and she doesn't die. She just knows what God knows. And in the Genesis narrative, there's this sort of cutaway to heaven where God is like, oh no, now they know what we know. We better get down there before they eat from the tree of life, and then they'll be gods themselves. So knowledge in certainly in Western culture, I think, I suspect other cultures. I just am not as aware of other cultural traditions. But that, knowledge is as this sort of primal drive in humanity. It's interesting that the snake never tempts Eve with power, or at least brute force. That there's nothing like that. It's knowledge. That's what we can't resist. And so I think that's part of it, is that we're driven to know things. And so often when we know things, we experience a kind of a loss of innocence, a falling into experience. I think, anyway, however you'd like to phrase that. And ultimately, that may be for the best, but I was thinking, it's the holidays, and I don't know, if you had good holidays when you were a kid, then you may think back to it, you think, oh, I wish, why can't it be like it was then when I could sit at the kiddie table? Now I have to sit with the adults and pretend to make conversation. And I think that there is a certain nostalgia that we have for our own ignorance in a way. Maybe it's because knowledge, in some odd way, becomes conflated with or tied up in death, the knowledge of death. That ultimately, when we learn about things, we're learning the world, we're learning the nature of the world, the transitory nature of the world, the passing of time, and ultimately we're learning about our own mortality and those of the ones we love.
I've read a lot of cosmic horror, published and unpublished, and a lot from aspiring horror authors. And something I've noticed is that a lot of people try to copy Lovecraft's style, although they never go quite as purple, quite as hard, which in my opinion is part of the fun, is how ridiculously purple he gets.
Right.
What's your approach stylistically?
Well, I like to vary my style. At this point in my life, I've been publishing professionally for about 20 years now. And when I first started writing, my goal was to write in this much more ornate style. And so I had in mind, in particular, someone like Henry James, to a certain extent, probably Peter Straub as well. And part of the reason for that was because it was not, at the time, it was not the way that people were writing. People were either writing in a kind of a quasi naturalistic voice that sort of, I'm talking about horror people,
Right.
that to a large extent derives from Stephen King, and which in turn derives, I think King derives probably from people like Richard Matheson, but also John D. MacDonald and the naturalists like Theodore Dreiser and Frank Norris and that. So I saw that a lot of the sort of default mode for a lot of I think probably American genre fiction in general. I'll just make huge sweeping generalizations, but at the time that I was starting anyway, was this kind of, sort of straightforward prose, which could be elegant at times, don't get me wrong, but I was not interested in that. I wanted to do something that was more ornate, more stylized, and I didn't quite want to go the Lovecraft route necessarily. But I think what attracts people to Lovecraft, and I think in fantasy, it's probably, if we were talking about fantasy, I imagine the question might be, why do so many people imitate Tolkien? I mean, I don't know if they do or not.
Right.
I'm just guessing. I'm thinking that Tolkien is the sort of analog for Lovecraft, and I think part of it is that these writers, they're writing outside of that kind of naturalistic mimetic tradition where the prose is often very plain. And Lovecraft, Tolkien, they let you have fun with language. They let you write these elaborate things. They're not afraid of quote unquote bad taste. I think that worrying about bad taste it's often that kind of self-consciousness, I think, can be the death of art. I think you have to be willing to do your thing, to let your freak flag fly. So I think that that's part of what Lovecraft and other horror writers, because I see it in Poe before Lovecraft, and I see it in someone like Ligotti after Lovecraft. And I think plenty of other writers as well. Nicole Cushing, for example, is a contemporary writer of weird stuff, or Michael Sisko, the same thing. I think that there's a way in which those kinds of stylistic experiments, they serve a number of, I think they serve a number of functions, right? One is just sort of delight, the sort of delight of like language games, if you will. But then I
Mhm.
think they allow the expression for the writer to express something of their own personality through writing in a way, they don't have to tamp down who they are in the same way, or to the same extent that they do if they're writing in sort of the mainstream of American naturalist writing. And I think probably too that there's a sense in which, what Lovecraft, let's say, right, just to take him, is trying to do, this is analogous to Tolkien, I think, is that they're trying to match the language to the subject matter, right? So that the craziness that Lovecraft is writing about is reflected in the language itself, so that the
Mhm.
language itself becomes excessive in the same way the subject matter is excessive. And so I think for me, I was drawn more to James when I started writing, because James is all about, especially as his fiction goes on, he's all about kind of the process of perception. And I was really fascinated by that idea, or that method for dealing with supernatural events, the process of perception, how you're coming to terms with whatever crazy thing is happening in front of you. Since that time, I've tried to write in other ways just to keep it fresh. So because I don't want to become a self parody just
Mm.
so I've tried to write in more stripped down prose, and then occasionally try different voices out to see. I mean, I'm sure that anybody who had a lot of free time to kill and wanted to make a study of my stories would find that there's certain underlying grammatical consistency and syntactical consistency. That's okay. That's fine. But I guess I at least want for myself, for my own, not just diversion, but kind of aesthetic interests, I want to try to keep things fresh stylistically.
Now, we all love cosmic horror fiction, but I think cosmic horror has a real problem with adaptations. Screen adaptations usually fall flat for me. They're usually just not scary. So, why do you think this is?
I think it's two things, right? Is that I think what you see in your mind is almost always going to be better than whatever is on the screen. There are maybe one or two exceptions of this. I still find the original Alien pretty frightening,
Yeah.
even though I know what it looks like. But there are certainly moments in the original Alien now when I watch it, right, where I'm like, oh no, that's a guy in a suit. I can see by the way I can see by the way the
Yeah.
arms are moving, even though the head is what gets your attention, and the head is this horrifying phallic thing. But if you look at the way the arms and the legs are moving, you're like, oh no, that's a person. And so that cuts it back a little bit, I think. I think it's a couple of things, right? I think that the number of films of sort of horror films that try to do cosmic horror are actually kind of on the lower end of the spectrum. I feel like, you've got zombie movies, you've got vampire movies, a ton of them, and some really good ones too, don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
But things that actually try to engage with the cosmic, with a sense of the minuscule size of humanity, if you will, that the sense of the sublime of scale. I think that those things are relatively few. And I'm thinking right now, okay, so Carpenter's The Thing is kind of a cosmic horror movie. I think it doesn't necessarily give you that sense of the sublime exactly, but in the sense of these people who are faced with this alien life form that is just horrifying, and which refuses to conform to recognizable categories. You just everything, it just keeps changing, it just keeps morphing. That might be that sort of trends, I think, in a cosmic horror direction, as I think that Prince of Darkness sort of does as
Mhm.
well. But I think I think you did. If you had emailed me about, is it The Endless, the Moorhead and Benson film?
The Endless, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
my probably my favorite cosmic horror movie.
yeah.
It does a really, really good job,
And I
especially with
think,
such a small budget.
yeah, yeah, no, I think those guys are terrific. I'm so impressed with what was the other one, that the one they did before that.
Spring, I think, that was really popular, about the guy who falls in love with the shapeshifter girl.
Yeah, yeah, and she, I mean, in a way, it's sort of funny. I was thinking about the one before that because that one ties into The Endless in some ways. And why can I not think of the name of it? I'm sorry, Moorhead and Benson, because I imagine they're hanging on my every word, right? But I think that what those guys have done actually comes closer to cosmic horror, comes the closest, I think, of a feeling of being trapped in this immense world. Also, it's kind of like it's an immense world that you just can't make add up. It just doesn't seem to fit together in a coherent kind of way. And I can appreciate that. I'm sure that if you're making a big budget Hollywood movie, you're like, the producer's like, this doesn't make any sense, and you're like, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm sure they want
"We
to have
need
a conversation.
spectacle, you gotta show the monster." "No!
Yeah, yeah.
No!"
I'm sure that they have a conversation with you after that, you know, and after that conversation.
We
So
need the monster to be something that we can cost effectively produce as a toy. So you've
exactly.
gotta take these gribbly bits out.
Yeah, yeah,
You
no,
gotta take this part
absolutely.
out. It's
I
harder to
mean,
manufacture.
Event Horizon, which I guess Event Horizon was going to be a Hellraiser movie, and then they,
Right.
for some reason, they cut Hellraiser out, but it is still basically Hellraiser in space,
Yeah.
and I would say that's cosmic horror adjacent or something like that. Actually, there was a recent, and by recent I mean like in the last 5 years, Scandinavian film called Aniara. Um,
Aniara, I don't know that
which
one.
okay, so this is about this giant spaceship. Earth is dying. Who knows why? It's just kind of used up, and so all these people have been loaded onto this spaceship called Aniara, and it's going to take them from Earth to Mars, which is what we're resettling, in about 3 weeks. And it gets struck by some space debris, and it shoots off in another direction, and they don't have the ability to get it back on track, and it's just shooting off into the void of space, and that's it. That's the movie. Is
Mm.
just now there are, the sort of the kid in me who read a lot of Robert Heinlein is like, hang on a second, but if you accept that they can't engineer their way back to Earth, that when you get to the end of that, I think is what I would say. When you get to the very, very end of that, that becomes a cosmic horror movie,
Mm.
um, which I don't want to spoil the end of it. Just if you've seen the end of it, hopefully you agree. If you haven't seen it, it's worth a look.
Okay, nice. And what was the name of that movie
It's
again?
called Aniara, Aniara.
Aniara. Alright,
And there
nice.
were a lot of, I will say, give a shout out to the streaming service Shudder.
Shutter Rocks.
Yeah, yeah, because they have just a ton of, like, I want to say low budget, but I don't mean that in a condescending kind of way. I just mean movies that are not $200 million blockbusters. And I feel at this point in time, like, horror movies they're some of the best movies, just because for all that we think to ourselves, oh, horror is such a cramped and restricting form and blah blah blah. Like, there's so much innovation in the films that you find on a channel like Shudder, that you can just turn it on and just pick something at random, and the chances are good that you're going to get some kind of weird, sure, it may be another vampire movie, but someone will have done something bizarre with the vampire, and then tried to play out the consequences of that. And I really think I'm really grateful for that.
Right, I think when you have a lower budget, you have more room to experiment. When you've got $300,000,000, you can't really take risks.
Oh, yeah, 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 no.
The studio needs to make a return on that investment. When you are trauma levels of budget, you can just do whatever you want. No one's gonna care care because it's so cheap. You're probably gonna make a profit no matter what.
Yeah, no, exactly, and I think that look, it's the big it's and I am far from an expert in this, so but in my very amateur eye, or from my very amateur viewpoint, It's the big problem with film and mainstream publishing at the moment is that because everything has become so consolidated, where now we have whatever it is, 4 or 5 publishers, I think we're down to 4,
Yeah.
and an equal number of movie studios, everything has to make a gigantic profit. There's no room, as we say, for the mid list in film or especially in publishing. That's and in publishing that's kind of been saved to some extent by small presses or independent publishers, if you prefer. And the same thing is true in film, but I don't think it's a sustainable model. I really
No.
I don't. But when we move away from that kind of precipice where we have to spend $300 million on a movie so that it can make us $1 billion. I don't know when we back off from that, when we finally say enough is enough. Maybe we don't. I don't know. I hope we do.
I hope so too. God. All right. Switching gears. Now, I noticed you set a lot of your work in rural upstate New York. The Fisherman was set in the waterways around, I think, Woodstock and Kingston, which my friend and I got a kick out of because we grew up around there. And my friend reading the book kept saying, I swam there. I swam in that river. Um,
Are you sure that they're still human? That would be my
yeah.
first question. Yeah.
It's 50-50.
Okay.
Your short story, City of the Dog, was set in the most terrifying place of all, Albany, New York. So, why do you choose this regional specificity? What do you get out of it? And have editors ever given you grief for setting your stories in a specific place that's not New York City or LA?
Actually, editors have been they've been lovely. I've never, the only person, ironically, who ever gave me any grief was S.T. Joshi in writing about me. And I think it was his modern horror book. He complained that I set all my stories in the Hudson Valley. And given that he's a big Lovecraft scholar, there's a certain irony there. But um,
Right,
for me, it was something I did. I actually started doing it when probably in grade school, maybe. I was, as I said, when I was a kid, I loved comics and I used to draw comic books, superhero comics, and I set 1 or 2 of them, sort of preliminary comic books in the Hudson Valley because I thought, wouldn't it be cool? But I think as much as anything, it had to do with a kind of imitation. Like I read Stephen King, and
right,
King said all his stuff or most of his stuff in Maine. So I actually wrote a couple of stories set in Maine, and my family had vacationed in Maine, so I was like, oh, okay. But then after that, after I'd used up those vacation spots, I needed a new place. And I just sort of thought, King's writing about Maine. I guess I should write about Poughkeepsie or the Mid Hudson Valley.
right.
And then when I got to college and I discovered, on the one hand, Faulkner, and on the other hand, I was reading William Kennedy, the great Albany writer, his novel Ironweed, which remains a favorite of mine. Like, they demonstrated to me that it wasn't just that you could use the surface of your area to inform your fiction, the landscape of it, but the kind of the deeper history of it you could try to dig into. And so, yeah, occasionally I'll set stories on the moon or, some other place just because I want to, or I think, okay, this is what it needs. But in a lot of ways, I like the thought of this area, of returning to this area, because I feel like in terms of European settlement of the United States, the Hudson Valley is reasonably old. And
Mm.
even in terms of the native presence here, there's some evidence that the Clovis people who disappeared about, I want to say about like 10,000 years ago, if you go over, I think it's somewhere north of Saugerties, so a little bit north of where I am now on the Hudson River, there's a flint napping site that goes back to around the end of the last ice age. So
Whoa.
yeah, I like that sense of a deeper history that I can draw on for my stuff.
That's cool because I was always wondering because I mentioned to someone that I was setting a story in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and they just got so grossed out. Like, why would you do that?
No, I think that's
Why would
so
you set something
cool.
in Fort Lee?
I
Like,
just think that's awesome. I want to read the Fort Lee story. You know what I mean? There's nothing wrong with, say, if you live in New York or if your story takes you to Manhattan, I mean, that's totally fine. But in a
yeah.
way, I'm much more interested in the Fort Lee, New Jersey story because you don't read stories set in Fort Lee. So let's see what that's about.
Let's talk a little more about The Fisherman. It's clearly influenced by Moby Dick. Is Moby Dick cosmic horror?
I think it is. I think it is in the sense of it's about an individual coming up against a vast and maybe unknowable universe. Ahab says at one point, all of reality is just a pasteboard mask. and his desire is to punch through that mask and find out what lies behind that. Is it nothing? Is it the void? Is it God? What kind of God is it? Is it something else, nature or whatever kind of principle you want to imagine? And in a sense, he never finds out. He's destroyed in his quest, and Ishmael just sort of escapes to tell this story. Moby Dick is ultimately not conquerable, and not only that, but as the narrative goes along, Moby Dick becomes this thing that is, yes, it took Ahab's leg, it dismasted him, as he says, and it can be this terrifying thing. But to other people, it's almost this creature of good omen. So it's this thing that just becomes, it's almost like the more you learn about it, the harder it gets to see or the harder it gets to understand. So I think that, yeah, I think that it fits into the cosmic horror thing. But I think what it gives us, what makes it so great is the figure of Ahab and the crew as well. But I think especially Ahab, I think for cosmic horror to work, there needs to be the person who's tempted to
Right.
the overreacher, the person who wants to know, to punch through that pasteboard mask. And I think in Ahab's case, because his first encounter with Moby Dick, he was just trying to kill a whale. He's a whaler. That's what he does, however distasteful I may find that. And then he has this terrifying encounter with this thing that almost kills him. And it drives him mad in a lot of ways. He's come so close to death, and in coming close to death, he's glimpsed the kind of absurdity of the universe, and he wants to find out, is it as mad as it seems? Is it as terrifying as it seems? And so I think that all of those things are what make that book so particularly effective. I think for anybody who was like, how do you write an effective cosmic horror story? In a way, I would say, think about your Ahab. Think about the character who wants to know this stuff, and don't worry as much like, what is it, Herbert West Reanimator. Don't make it a Herbert West Reanimator, like make it somebody who's got really something at stake. And then if you can figure that out, if you can make it someone who has something at stake, then I won't say the cosmic horror is almost incidental, but I think a lot of people worry maybe more, or newer writers worry more about, oh, I've come up with a new monster for the Lovecraft mythos. I mean, sure, that's
Mhm.
great, but don't. I would say that you could have the same old monster, Cthulhu, whatever. But if the person who's driven to find that monster or to access it or whatever, if that person is compelling, that's what'll make the difference.
Now, the structure of this novel is a little unusual. The middle half is this long, extended story within a story flashback passed down by a guy at a diner. Why did you choose to structure the novel that way?
Well, initially, I didn't think it was going to be a novel. I thought it was going to be a novella,
Mm,
and longer novella. But I really thought that the story that would be in the middle, each of the chapters was probably about 20 pages, and maybe even a little less at that point. And so I thought that the story would be 20 pages, maybe 30, might be a little bit longer, and then I would come back for the rest of the novella, the rest of that sort of framing story. And then the story just grew in the telling, and it grew and it grew and it grew. And it kind of freaked me out. I was like, oh my God, I'm writing a novel. And
yeah.
I put it aside for a while. And then I wrote House of Windows, my actual first novel instead. Like, so I think I was just ready to write a novel. And
Yeah.
so, yeah. And then I was like, oh man, the structure, this is so weird. What should I do? But I just decided to trust it. And yeah, ultimately that seems to have been the right call. Although there are still people who say I can't buy it. There's this long narrative in the middle, and I've tried to account for that, but I get it. For some people, that kind of the long narrative, the long oral tradition or oral narrative, even if it's like, well, yeah, I wrote this down afterwards or whatever, I get it that for some people that's a deal breaker.
Mm.
I've always loved stories like that. I've always loved in Faulkner's work or Conrad's work where you just get these long someone's you're just sitting on the porch in the afternoon drinking your mint juleps or whatever, and somebody just is like, oh, let me tell you the entire history of my life, and you're like, oh, okay.
Now, there was also something unusual I saw in that novel, and that our protagonist at the end is faced with this journey into the unknown. And going deeper into these cursed woods, and he makes a decision that's a little unusual, spoiler alert, among horror protagonists, in that he decides, no, I'm not gonna do this. I'm out of here. Fuck that. So why did you decide to end the novel that way?
Well, it was interesting. I've been thinking for actually, it's funny for that novel and my other. Actually, I guess it's funny because I'm thinking my first novel, House of Windows, and then after The Fisherman, I wrote a short novel called Saphira, which was included in a collection called Saphira and Other Betrayals. And in a way, at the novel length, I've been really fascinated by ideas of choice because choice so often doesn't seem to enter into horror narratives. Horror
Mm.
narratives are about the lack of choice or when is choice taken away from you. And so I've been really fascinated by the way that you might incorporate choice and moments of choice into horror narratives. And I think I wanted somebody who was sort of clear sighted enough to reject a bad choice even as his friend could not reject that bad choice. And I suppose I wanted that to be oddly hopeful that you might, because as many people have observed, The Fisherman in particular it is a book about grief and grieving. So I wanted there to be a moment where somebody could not be swallowed by their grief, still grieve, but not be swallowed by it in the same way that someone else might be. So
Do you feel like there's a little bit of untapped potential in cosmic horror in a contemporary setting?
yeah, absolutely.
The age of information. I mean, we're talking about information and knowledge that drives you insane. That's kind of what Facebook did to our parents' generation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Or just, I was thinking of this because I was watching that Chernobyl miniseries on HBO the other day, and I'm thinking, like, this is cosmic horror. Russians summoned Cthulhu, basically.
Yes. Yeah,
This is
absolutely.
fucked.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think that it cosmic horror where we poisoned, well, maybe that's a little melodramatic, but we poisoned parts of the planet and we have changed the planet. We have changed the planet. Bad things are coming. I hope that we can get it together enough to try to do something about them. But I'm pretty pessimistic about. I mean, something's going to happen. Can we avoid making the planet completely uninhabitable? I hope so. But sea levels are rising, and we have nations full of people that live at sea level. That's going to be a problem. So I think that I think that there are changes that are happening, catastrophic, gigantic changes that are happening on Earth already that cosmic horror is just ideally suited to deal with, to engage in a kind of metaphorical kind of a way. I think the sort of further out we look into the universe, the stranger the universe gets. We had that strange asteroid that plunged through the solar system and then out of the solar system again. And I think what was up with that? It was
Mhm.
probably just an asteroid, but boy, do I want to believe it was some kind of Arthur C. Clarke-esque alien probe or something like that. What's coming next? So I think that there's still. If cosmic horror is in a sense about knowledge or concerned with knowledge and extremes of knowledge, if there are ways in which its modern form comes out of the scientific revolutions of the late 19th and then into the 20th centuries, things like evolution and our expanding understanding of the cosmos and the size of the cosmos and so on, and also our understanding of how little we understand about human consciousness and how human consciousness works, then I think there's no reason to think that we can't just keep going with it because there are so many things about our own existence that we don't understand. And yeah, cosmic horror seems to me absolutely as well suited as anything to engage that in a really potent kind of way.
Have you seen really good atomic cosmic horror? Because it seems like it's a perfect subject for it, and I this might just be me not looking in the right places, but I'm not
Uh,
sure if I've seen any of it.
yeah, not, I
Because
don't
it seems
know.
like just seems perfect for it. Splitting the atom, which is, I think the word is supposed to mean at its root unbreakable,
Right, right.
violating this immense boundary that we were supposed to never ever cross.
Yeah, I mean, it shows up in Garth Ennis's Invisibles comic book. He relates the origin of the bad guys to the detonation of the atomic bomb in was it Taos, when
Yeah.
Oppenheimer said, "I am become death, the whatever destroyer of
Destroyer
worlds,"
of
whatever.
Worlds.
That in essence acts as a spell that releases all kinds of monstrous entities into our universe. And I I um. I'm embarrassed to say that I still haven't seen season 3 of Twin Peaks, but
Oh, yeah,
it's
yeah,
my
that's where Bob came
understanding.
from. He was sort
Yeah,
of brought in from the atomic bomb. It just
yeah.
ushered this unspeakable evil.
Yeah, and I mean, you could make a sort of. I mean, obviously, the kaiju movies do this, although it's not really frightening in the same way that we're talking about. I mean, not in the way it could be. I think that I think they're. What was that movie, Cloverfield? Although it became just kind of a bit silly at the end, but it was trying to do something with the idea of this, just this massive thing to which we are as just sort of ticks or whatever, just kind of running amok. I think there is something you could do with that, but it's tough. It's tough for it not to be too silly.
Yeah. Now, in the acknowledgement section of your first novel, or your first completed novel, House of Windows, you
Mhm.
wrote that you had trouble finding a home for the book. You said the genre people thought it was too literary, and the literary people thought it was too genre. A ton of my writer friends find themselves in this same awkward position where they're writing stuff that I personally think is amazing, but they're having trouble finding a home for it because it's in this awkward in between place. Do you have any advice? How do you
Um,
get your book published?
we for both novels, actually, for both House of Windows and The Fisherman, my agent went to all the big presses. And I mean, she went, the as I said, the mainstream presses were like, well, this is well written, but I mean, there's a monster in here. And then the genre presses were like, there's a monster, but oh, what's all this good writing? I mean, that's a little obnoxious on my part, and I apologize. But yeah, they were not interested in the sort of character development stuff that I wanted to do. And I think about something Glenn Hirschberg said to me once. He said, "Man, if I could have figured out how to sell out, I would have done it years ago." Um, so there is a part of me that would say to your friends or to anybody, just do you. You've got to, like, do what you've got to do. And I get it, right? That we all, we're writing as a form of communication. At this point, we want to get published, but I think, as we were saying earlier, so much of publishing is very conservative from an aesthetic standpoint right now, and they're very, very nervous about anything that is out of the ordinary in any way. Some stuff does get published. I mean, by big presses, but it seems in a lot of ways so few and far between. So in some ways, I think smaller presses offer a way forward. It's a little tricky because you need to be very careful. Some, small presses also can just implode
Oh, yeah.
because of bad decisions on the part of the people running them. So you need to do your homework a bit to see who it is you want to work with. But for example, Word Horde, who've published me, and then Undertow Press, in Canada, are two pretty solid presses. They're part of the reason they're solid is they're somewhat conservative themselves. They do publish more daring stuff, but they don't overextend themselves.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that on the smaller press level is probably a good idea. But I would absolutely say, do you, whatever you is, just be aware that if you want to be rich,
Mhm.
this may not be the way to do it, you know?
Actually, speaking of that, are you comfortable talking about money? Because
Sure,
it is
yeah.
a taboo subject among many artists, but I feel it's really important to talk about this in terms of writing because so many people have a wildly unrealistic idea about how much writing fiction pays. I've seen people go into it expecting to make a living on it or even to get rich on it. Like, oh.
Yeah,
So
that's it's I mean, so the problem is that if you say that'll never happen, then someone will say, "What about J.K. Rowling?" or "What about Stephen
right.
King?" or "What about Tom Clancy?" And yes, there are people who are now very wealthy because of their writing. It has to be acknowledged. My understanding is that There are 300 people in the United States right now who are making a living as writers. And that's out of a population of over 300 million. Now, okay, obviously not all of them are writing books. But if, man, I can't remember, was it 50,000 new books were published last year? I mean, I'm just kind of,
Right.
I'm almost making that up because I just
I
can't
have no
remember.
idea.
But it was a
You
lot,
could make up a number. I won't know.
right?
You can lie to me. I have no idea.
Just, it, But so that is not to discourage anybody from writing. But if you're thinking this is my get rich quick scheme, you need to find another get rich quick scheme. The reason that you write has to be because you can't not write. If you're one of those people, I'm like this, right? There are a few days I'm getting kind of crabby. I'm like, what is wrong with me? And then I realize, you haven't been writing for a couple of days. And I think, oh, and
Yeah.
then I write and I feel better. That's what I'm talking about. If you're, I almost want to say, if you're writing for almost any other reason, and I know that's a kind of high bar to set, but I feel that it is such an investment of time and energy that if you're just thinking, I guess it's like the person who thinks I can play 3 chords on the guitar. I'm going to be a rock and roll star. I mean, could it happen? Yes, possibly, but the odds are not great. And so I think advances for novels, if you get really lucky, you could get $5,000. And that's $5,000 that's going to be paid out in 3 installments over the space of, depending on your publishing deal, like a year to 18 months.
Mm.
So, yeah, so what would that be? Like $1,600 ballpark per, and that's before your agent gets their 15%. So yeah, that would be about $1,500, I guess per. Now that's nice. $1,500 is nothing to sneeze at, and you could put it away in the bank. You could pay some bills. You could buy yourself. Oh, there's a book, a nice book you really want. You could buy that, but that's kind of it. And that 5,000 that you've been paid, let's say, that's all you're going to get until your book earns out. And what that means is where it sells enough copies that it earns back the money that was paid to you, right? So in that case, maybe you're lucky and it sells very quickly. And within a year, you could be getting some royalties. It could take several years for that to happen. And again, then you'll be getting some royalties. But in the meantime, what are you doing to keep body and soul together? So I think that, but having said this, having said $5,000, it's as likely you'll get $1,000. In which case, yes, you're getting about $300, a time spaced out over several months. So those are sobering numbers. Now, of course, everybody thinks, oh, I'll get picked up by Hollywood. Or everybody hopes, I guess,
Right.
I'll get picked up by Hollywood. A Hollywood option, again, could be $5,000. Hollywood is, what they want is they want to put a placeholder on your book. Let's imagine that you write this great book, and although it's a small press book, still it makes its way into the hands of a filmmaker who says, maybe I'd like to do something with this someday when I don't have 15 other projects, or when I'm done with my 15 other projects.
Right.
So to a certain extent, all they're doing is they're saying, hey, you know what? I can give you a couple of grand so that nobody else gets to make this. And if you get a film agent, which you would want to have in that case, the film agent might be able to talk them up, right? But it's going to be, oh, they offered 1,000, I think I can get you 2,500, or they offered 2,500, maybe I can get you 5. So again, that's lovely. That does feel like free money in some ways, right? That someone just gave you $5,000, let's say, for the 18, and what's called an option, but it's going to be like, let's say, an 18-month option. So for the next 18 months, nobody can touch that book except this person. And at the end of 18 months, look, they might decide, I still think I can do it. And they re-up the option. You may get 5,000 for another 18 months, but now you've made $10,000 over 3 years. Um, which,
Hell
and
yeah, money bags.
yeah, this is why I hate math. And so and again, as an extra, all of this is fantastic. So your kid needs braces, and suddenly you get a check for, they're going to give you a check for $5,000. Hey, you just covered the cost of your kid's braces, and that's fantastic. And then that doesn't have to come out of the regular budget. But the fantasies, that are fed by TV and movies, in particular, of the writer who is living in a giant apartment and New York City and solving crimes with the cops. That doesn't really happen. So I think that you need to have a day job or marry a rich person. That's also a
Yeah.
possibility, you know?
Yeah, that is the secret that a lot of successful writers have,
Exactly.
unfortunately.
You just wanna find a rich person, and you wanna just hang on to them like a lamprey on a shark that's just undetected and sucking them dry. And
Mhm.
but I think that you're gonna need a day job, and you need to think a bit about that. You need to think about a job that is going to provide you health insurance, that's going to pay your bills. A lot of writers choose teaching, some form of teaching. Understandable, you get a couple of months off in the summer. You think to yourself, "Oh, well, school's out by 3, I'll write my novel in the evenings." Yeah, it's a lot of professions, teaching among them, they draw on the same kinds of creative resources in your brain that feed your writing. And so it's funny, many years ago when I was an adjunct, I was teaching at SUNY New Paltz. One of my colleagues there said, I'm just telling my students, get a job at Starbucks because they give you health insurance, the pay is pretty good, and it doesn't drain you. Like you can still write after working at Starbucks. And
Mm.
I was like, I don't think their parents are going to be thrilled with that advice. Um, but he may be right. Raymond Carver, the late Raymond Carver, used to say the best job he ever had was a janitor's job where he worked the night shift and he was the janitor for this local high school. And he had figured out that he could get all his work done within about 2 hours, mopping the floors, whatever, cleaning the boards or whatever. And then he had 6 hours to write and he was in a school by himself. So, and again, it's a kind of story where it's like, oh, so you're telling me to be a janitor. Well, I guess what I'm saying is that in Carver's case, let's say, that really allowed him to focus on his work, but also still provide food for his family and such. And again, the all important health insurance. So I think that those are difficult conversations to have with yourself. Of course, you believe in yourself, and if you're a writer, that's part of what you have to do is to believe in yourself, but you also have to be kind of fair to yourself in some ways and say, okay, what am I going to do until I get my big break, which may never come.
Right. Right, right. I mean, it is important. I've found bureaucracy work is pretty good in that there's a fair bit of downtime during certain times of the year, and it uses up absolutely zero of my creativity.
Yeah,
None whatsoever.
yeah. I want to say it was I think it was Bernard Malamud, if I recall, worked in a government office. And again, same thing. He'd found that he could get, if he just put his head down, he could get most of his work done in a couple hours in the morning. And then the rest of the day, he would just type his stories. And anybody walking by was like, look at that Malamud. What a good worker he is. And they had no idea because he had his work done and
Right.
they just saw him typing and they were like, oh, he must be doing his work, for us.
Yeah. That's definitely the way to do it. That is the best way.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think so. I think so.
Oh, and unrelated question. Was that jingling sound in the background a dog?
Yes,
Yes.
my tiny little dog. We have my wife and I have 5 dogs,
What?
and yeah, we have a big Labradoodle, and
That's so many dogs.
we have 3 pit mixes, and then we have this little dog who's a Dachshund Beagle mix, and she's more my dog than the other. I mean, they all love my wife, and they basically are like, she's in charge, and I'm like, what about me? And this little dog gives me the most attention, I guess, of the rest. She indulges me the most.
Nice. Ah, dachshunds and beagles are ridiculously cute, so I'm
They
guessing
are.
this little guy is
Yeah,
impossibly adorable.
I just love her. We got along right from the get go, and it was a sort of a. My sister sort of inherited her from a coworker who just kind of dumped her on my sister, and then we wound up watching her for a week because my sister was away, and the dog and I just bonded, and that was that.
How do you
So
dump a wiener beagle?
you know,
That's the
um,
perfect dog. It's the
yeah,
best combination.
it was. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how these people did that. And my sister was just, it was not a dog she particularly wanted, and
Mm,
so yeah, I was quite happy to take her. So yeah,
yeah.
now she's my little mascot.
Nice. Nice. All right. Last question. What are you working on currently?
My fifth collection of stories will be out. I thought it was going to be out in January, but it looks, I mean, we've kind of had to push it back a couple of times. And now it looks like with all this supply chain stuff, it's
Yeah.
probably going to be March. It's called Corpse Mouth and Other Autobiographies. It's a collection of stories that, as the subtitle suggests, were really drawn very strongly from my own autobiography. And
Mm,
that'll be out. And I'm also reissuing my first collection, Mr. Gaunt, which has been out of print for a little while. So that should be back January or February, I think, depending on those
nice.
same supply issues. And yeah, actually, it's going to be kind of a busy year. I have a novella coming out in, I think it's Tor anthology that John Taff edited called Dark Stars, and that's a Wendigo story. And then
Nice.
I have a story coming out in one of Ellen Datlow, like a monster anthology, another novella that should be out. I think June or July, something like that. So yeah, it's going to be. I'm saturating the market. That's the way it's
That
looking. And
sounds good.
yeah, it's one, sometimes it happens that you just like you've written stuff over maybe a long period of time, but the way the sort of whatever publishing cycles align, suddenly all your stuff is just coming out at the same time.
Nice. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up. It's been an hour. Thanks
Okay.
again for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk.
Yeah. And thank you, audience, for listening. That's all for this episode. If you like what you heard, head to patreon.com/writegood and subscribe. When we get to 100 subscribers, we'll do a special episode about Marian Engel's Bear, an award-winning Canadian novel about a woman who starts a torrid love affair with a bear. Until next time, keep writing good.
This has been Rite Good with Raquel S. Benedict. Hosted by Raquel S. Benedict and produced by Matt Keeley for KS Media LLC. Theme song by Surgeryhead. This has been a Kitty Sneezes production. For comments and concerns, please write to us at writegud@kittysneezes.com. That is RITEGUD at kittysneezes.com. If you'd like to support us, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/writegood.
kittysneezes.com in color.